Once a devotee asked Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharishi, "What is the purpose of self realization?" Bhagwan said, "Self realization is the final goal and is itself the purpose." Devotee asked, "I mean, what use is it?" Bhagwan said, "Why do you ask about self realization? Why don't you rest content with your present state? It is evident that you are discontented, and your discontent will come to an end if you realize the self." Devotee asked, "What is the goal of this purpose?" Bhagwan said, "Realize the real." Devotee asked, "What is the nature of reality?" Bhagwan said, "Existence without beginning or end, eternal. Existence everywhere, endless, infinite. Existence underlying all forms, all changes, all forces, all matter, and all spirit. The many change and pass away, whereas the one always endures. The displaces the triads such as knower, knowledge, and known. The triads are only appearances in time and space, whereas the reality lies beyond and behind them. They are like a mirage over the reality. They are the result of delusion." Devotee asked, "If I am also an illusion, who cast off the illusion?" Bhagwan said, "The I cast off the illusion of I, and yet remains I." Such is the paradox of self realization. The realized do not see any contradiction in it. Some people who come here don't ask me about themselves, but about the Jivan Mukta, liberated while still embodied. Thus he see the world. Is he subject to destiny? Can one be liberated only after leaving the body or while yet alive? Should the body of a sage resolve itself into light or disappear from sight in a miraculous way? Can one who leaves a corpse behind at death be liberated? Their questions are endless. Why worry about all these things? Thus, liberation consists in knowing the answer to these questions. So I tell them, never mind about liberation. First, find out whether there is such a thing as bondage. Examine yourself first. Bhagwan said, in a sense, speaking of self realization is a delusion. It is only because people have been under the delusion that the known self is the self and the unreal the real, that they have to be weaned out of it by the other delusion called self realization, because actually the self always is the self and there is no such thing as realizing it. Who is to realize what and how, when all that exists in the self and nothing but the self? Devotee asked, "Do we go to Swarga, heaven, as a result of our actions here?" Bhagwan said, "Heaven is as real as your present life, but if we ask who we are and discover the self, what need is there to think of heaven?" Devotee asked, "Is Vaikuntha heaven? Is the Supreme Self?" Bhagwan said, "Where is the Supreme Self or heaven unless in you?" Devotee said, "But heaven may appear to one involuntarily." Bhagwan said, "Does this world appear voluntarily?" The yogic centers, counting from the bottom upwards, are a series of centers in the nervous system, each having its own kind of power or knowledge. There are no stages in realization or mukti, there are no degrees of liberation. Devotee asked, "There must be stage after stage of progress, because before attaining the absolute, are there different levels of reality?" Bhagwan said, "There are no levels of reality, there are only levels of experience for the individual, not of reality. If anything can be gained with which was not there before, it can also be lost, whereas the absolute is eternal, here and now." Can a man become a high official merely by seeing one? He may become one only if he strives and equips himself for the position. Similarly, can the ego, which is in bondage as the mind, becomes the divine self simply because it has once glimpsed that it is the self? Is this not impossible without the destruction of the mind? Can a beggar become a king by merely visiting a king and declaring himself to be one. Devotee asked, can self realization be lost again after once being attained? Bhagwan said, realization takes time to study itself. The self is certainly within the direct experience of everyone, but not in the way people imagine. One can only say that it is as it is, just as incantations or other devices can prevent fire from burning a man when otherwise it would do so. So, Vasna's inherent tendencies impelling one to desire one thing and to shun another can veil the self when otherwise it would be apparent. Owing to the fluctuations of the Vasanas, realization takes time to study itself. Spasmodic realization is not enough to prevent rebirth, but it cannot become permanent as long as there are vasanas. In the presence of a great master, vasanas cease to be active and the mind becomes still, so that samadhi, absorption in realization, results just as in the presence of various devices, fire doesn't burn. Thus, the disciple gains true knowledge and right experience in the presence of a master. But if this is to be established, further effort is necessary, then he will know it to be his real being and thus be liberated while still living. You are the self even now, but you confuse your present consciousness or ego with the absolute consciousness or self. This false identification is due to ignorance, and ignorance disappears together with the ego. Killing the ego is the only thing to be done. Realization already exists. No attempt need be made to attain it, for it is not anything external or new to be acquired. It is always and everywhere, here and now too. Devotee said the method seems to be quicker than the usual one of cultivating the virtues alleged to be necessary for realization. Bhagwan said, yes, all vices center round the ego. When the ego is gone, realization results naturally. Devotee asked, what are the powers of Superman? Bhagwan said, whether the powers are high or low, whether of the mind or what you call the supermind, they exist only with reference to him who possesses them. Find out who that it is. Bhagwan said, he that would abide in the self should never swerve from his one pointed attention to the self or the pure being that he is. If he slips or swerves away from that state, several kinds of vision conjured up by the mind may be seen, but one should not be misled by such visions, which may be of light or space, nor by the nada or subtle sounds that may be heard, nor by the visions of a personified God, seen either within oneself or outwardly, as if they had an objective reality. One should not mistake any of these things for the reality. When the principle of intellection by which these visions and so on are cognized or perceived is itself false or illusory, how can the objects thus cognized, much less the visions perceived, be real? There are some foolish persons who, not realizing that they themselves are moved by the divine power, seek to attain all supernatural power of action. They are like the lame man who said, I can dispose of the enemy if someone will hold me up on my legs. Since peace of mind is permanent in liberation, how can they who yoke their mind to powers which are unattainable except through the activity of the mind become merged in the bliss of liberation which subdues the agitation of the mind? Devotee asked, can a yogi know his past lives? Bhagwan said, do you know the present life so well you wish to know the past? Find the present, then the rest will follow. Even with your present limited knowledge, you suffer much. Why should you burden yourself with more knowledge? It is it so far as to suffer more? Devotee asked, does Bhagwan use occult powers to make others realize the self, or is the mere fact of Bhagwan's realization enough for that? Bhagwan said, the spiritual force of realization is far more powerful than the use of all occult powers, inasmuch as there is no ego in the sage, there are no others for him. What is the highest benefit that can be conferred on you? It is happiness, and happiness is born of peace. Peace can reign only where there is no disturbance, and disturbance is due to thoughts that arise in the mind. When the mind is itself absent, there will be perfect peace. Unless a person has annihilated the mind, he can gain peace and be happy, and unless he himself is happy, he cannot bestow happiness on others. Since, however, there are no others for the sage who has the mind, the mere fact of his self realization is itself enough to make the others happy too. When asked if occult powers, siddhis, can be achieved with the divine state, as mentioned in the last verse of Dakshinamurti Stotra, the Maharishi said, let the divine state be achieved first, and then the other questions may be raised. No powers can extend into self realization, so how can they extend beyond it? People who desire powers are not content with their idea of pure consciousness. They are inclined to neglect the supreme happiness of realization for the sake of powers. In search of these, they follow by lanes instead of high road, and so risk losing their way in order to guide them aright and keep them on the high road. They are told that powers accompany realization. In fact, realization comprises everything, and the realized man will not waste a thought on powers. Let people first get realization and then seek powers if they still want to. Devotee asked, is it not necessary or at least advantageous to render the body invisible in one's spiritual progress? Bhagwan said, why do you think of that? Are you the body? Devotee asked, no, but advanced spirituality must effect the change in the body, must not it? Bhagwan said, what change do you desire in the body, and why? Devotee asked, is not invisibility evidence of advanced wisdom jnana? Bhagwan said, in that case, all those who spoke and wrote and passed their lives in the sight of others must be considered ignorant. Devotee asked, but the sages Vasishtha and Valmiki possessed such powers. Bhagwan said, it may have been their destiny, prarabdha, to develop such powers, siddhis, side by side with their wisdom, jnana. Why should you aim at that which is not essential but is apt to prove a hindrance to wisdom, jnana? Does the sage jnani feel oppressed by his body being visible? Devotee said, no. Bhagwan asked, a hypnotist can suddenly render himself invisible. Is he therefore a sage? Devotee said, no. Bhagwan said, visibility and invisibility refer to him who sees. Who is that? Solve that question first. Other questions are unimportant. Devotee said, I have been interesting myself in metaphysics for over 20 years, but I have not gained any noble experiences as so many others claim to. I have no powers of clairvoyance, clairaudience, and so on. I feel locked up in this body, nothing more. Bhagwan said, that is all right. Reality is only one, and that is the self. All other things are mere phenomena in it, of it, and by it. Seer, sight, and seen are all the self only. Can anyone see or hear without the self? What difference does it make if you see or hear anyone close up or at a great distance? The organs of sight and hearing are needed in both cases. So is the mind. None of them can be dispensed with. In either case, you are dependent on them. Why then should there be any glamour about clairvoyance or clear audience? Moreover, what is acquired will also be lost in due course. It can never be permanent. The only permanent thing is reality, and that is the self. You say, I am going, I am speaking, I am working, and so on. Hyphenate and the I am in all of them. Thus, I am, that is the abiding and fundamental reality. This truth was taught by God to Moses. I am that I am. Be still and know that I am God. So I am is God. Once attained, the state of self realization is the same by whatever path and in whatever region it may be approached. There are three aspects of God according to one's approach to realization. They are Sat, Chit, Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. The aspect of being is emphasized by Gyanis, who are said to repose in the essence of being after incessant search and to have their individuality lost in the Supreme. The consciousness aspect is approached by yogis who exert themselves to control their breath, in other to steady the mind, and are then said to see the glory, consciousness of being, of God as the one light radiating in all directions. The beatitude aspect is approached by devotees who become intoxicated with the nectar of love of God and lose themselves in bliss experience. Unwilling to leave this, they remain for ever merged in God. The four margas, karma, bhakti, yoga, and jnana are not exclusive of one another. They are described separately in classical works only to convey an idea of the appropriate aspect of God to appeal readily to the aspirant according to his predisposition. The sannyasi visitor Swami Lokesh Nanda asked about samadhi. Bhagwan said, holding on to reality is samadhi. Second, holding on to samadhi with effort is savikalpa samadhi. Third, merging in reality and remaining unaware of the world is nirvikalpa samadhi. Fourth, merging in ignorance and remaining unaware of the world is sleep. Fifth, remaining in the primal, pure, natural state without effort is Sahaj Nirvikalpa Samadhi. The old gentleman asked Bhagwan whether it was not necessary to go through Nirvikalpa Samadhi first before attaining to Sahaj Samadhi. Bhagwan replied, when we have tendencies that we are trying to give up, that is to say, when we are still imperfect and have to make conscious efforts to keep the mind one pointed or free from thought, the thoughtless state which we does attain is Nirvikalpa Samadhi. When through practice we are always in that state, not going into Samadhi and coming out again, that is the Sahaj state. In the Sahaj state, one sees only the self and one sees the world as a form assumed by the self. Devotee asked, can a man who has attained realization move about and act and speak? Bhagwan said, why not? Do you suppose realization means being inert like a stone or becoming nothing? Devotee said, I don't know, but they say that the highest state is withdrawal from all sense activities, thoughts, and experiences, in fact, cessation of activity. Bhagwan said, then how would it differ from deep sleep? Besides, it would be state which, however exalted, comes and goes, and would therefore not be the natural state. So how could it represent the eternal presence of the Supreme Self, which persists through all states and survives them? It is pure that there is such a state, and that in the case of some people, it may be necessary to go through it. It may be a temporary phase of the quest, or it may persist to the end of a man's life. If it be the divine will or the man's destiny, but in any case, you cannot call it the highest state. If it were, you would have to say that not only the sages, but God Himself has not attained the highest state, since not only are the realized sages very active, but the personal God, Ishvara Himself, is obviously not in this supremely inactive state, since He presides over the world and directs its activities. Devotee asked, "What is samadhi?" Bhagwan said, "In yoga, the term is used to indicate some kind of trance, and there are various kinds of samadhi, but the samadhi I speak to you about is different. It is Sahaj Samadhi. In this state, you remain calm and composed. During activity, you realize that you are moved by the deeper real self within and unaffected by what you do or say or think. You have no worries, anxieties, or cares. For you realize that there is nothing that belongs to you as ego, and that everything is being done by something with which you are in conscious union." A visitor said, "Realized men generally withdraw from active life and abstain from worldly activity." Bhagwan said, "They may or they may not. Some, even after realization, carry on trade or business or rule to kingdom. Some withdraw to solitary places and abstain from all activity more than the minimum necessary to keep life in the body. We cannot make any general rule about it." Yes, and it is the best help you possibly can give them. But in fact, there are no others to help. People often say that a realized man should go about preaching his message. They ask how a man can remain quiet in realization when there is misery also existing. But what is a realized man? Does he see misery outside himself? They want to determine his state without themselves realizing it. From his standpoint, their contention amount to this: a man has a dream in which he sees a number of persons. On waking up, he asks, "Have the people in dream also woken up?" It is ridiculous. Again, some good man says, "It doesn't matter even if I don't get realization. Let me be the last man in the world to get it, so that I can help all the others to become realized before I do." That is just like the dreamer saying, "Let all these people in the dream wake up before I do." He would be no more absurd than this amiable philosopher. A saying of Lao Tse from the Tao Te Ching was read out in the whole. By his non-action the sage governs all. Sri Bhagwan remarked, "Non-action is unceasing activity." The sage is characterized by eternal and incessant activity. His stillness is like the apparent stillness of a fast rotating top. It is moving too fast for the eye to see, so it appears to be still. Yet it is rotating, so is the apparent inaction of the sage. This has to be explained because people generally mistake his stillness for inertness. It is not so. This morning, a visitor said to Bhagwan, "The realized man has no karma. He is not bound by destiny. So why should he still retain a body?" Bhagwan said, "Who asked this question, a realized man or an unrealized man? Why worry about what the realized man does or why he does anything? Better think about yourself." He was then silent. After a while, however, he explained further, "You are under the impression that you are the body, so you think the realized man also has a body. Does he say that he has one? He may seem to you to have one and to do things with it as others do, The charged ashes of a rope look like a rope, but they are of no use to tie anything with. So long as one identifies oneself with the body, all this is hard to understand. This is why it is sometimes said in answer to such questions that the body of the realized man continues to exist until his destiny has worked itself out and then it falls away. An example of this that is sometimes given is that an arrow which has been loosened from the bow, destiny must continue its course and hit the mark, even though the animal that stood there has moved away and another has taken its place. Realization has been achieved. But the truth is that the realized man has transcended all destiny and is bound neither by the body nor by its destiny. The sensations is common both to the realized man and the unrealized man. The difference is that the unrealized man identifies himself with the body that feels it, whereas the realized man knows that all this is self, all this is Brahm. If there is pain, let it be. It is also a part of the self, and the self is perfect. An unrealized man sees one who is realized and identifies with him, the body, because he doesn't know the self and mistake the body for the self. He extends the same mistake to the body of the realized man. The latter is therefore considered to be the physical form. Again, the unrealized man, though in fact not the originator of his actions, imagines himself to be so, and he considers the actions of the body as his own actions, and therefore he thinks that the realized man is acting in the same way because his body is active, but then later knows the truth and is not deceived. His state cannot be understood by the unrealized, and therefore the question of his actions troubles the later. Although it doesn't arise for himself, all good or divine qualities are included in jnana, spiritual enlightenment, and all bad or sanatic qualities in spiritual darkness. When jnana comes, all ajnana goes, so that all divine qualities come automatically. If a man is a jnani, he cannot utter lies or commit any sin. Devotee asked, can we think without the mind? Bhagwan said, thoughts can continue like other activities. They do not disturb the supreme consciousness. People surmise the existence of the pure mind in the Jivan Mukta and the personal God. They ask how he could otherwise live and act, but this is only a concession to argument. The pure mind is in fact absolute consciousness, the object to be witnessed and the witness finally merge together, and absolute consciousness alone remains. It is not a state of blank or ignorance, but it is the supreme self. The moon shines by reflecting the light of the sun. When the sun has set, the moon is useful for displaying objects. When the sun has risen, no one needs the moon. Although its disk is visible in the sky, so it is with the mind and the heart. The mind is made useful by its reflected light. It is used for seeing objects. When turned inwards, it merges into the source of illumination which shines by itself, and the mind is then like the moon in daytime. The mind of the realized man is sometimes compared to the moon in daytime. People are afraid that when the ego or the mind is killed, the result may be a mere blank and not happiness. What really happens is that the thinker, the object of thought and thinking all merge in the one source, which is consciousness and bliss itself, and thus that the state is neither inert nor blank. I don't understand why people should be afraid of a state in which all thoughts cease to exist and the mind is killed. They daily experience it in sleep. There is no mind or thought in sleep, yet when one rises from sleep, one says, I slept well. In answer to a visitor, Bhagwan made the following remark: you can have, or rather, you will yourself be the highest imaginable kind of happiness. All other kinds of happiness, which you have spoken of as pleasure, joy, happiness, bliss, are only reflections of the Ananda which in pure true nature you are. It is impossible to describe samadhi since it transcends the mind. It can only be experienced. An American lady asked Bhagwan what is his experience of samadhi were. When it was suggested that she should relate her experience and ask if they were right, she replied that Sri Bhagwan experiences ought to be correct and should be known, whereas her own were unimportant. She wanted to know whether Sri Bhagwan felt his body hot or cold in samadhi, whether he spent the first 3.5 years of his stay in Trivanmalai in prayer, and so on. Bhagwan said samadhi transcends mind and speech and cannot be described. The state of deep sleep cannot be described. The state of samadhi even less. The devotee asked, but I know that I was unconscious in deep sleep. Bhagwan said, consciousness and unconsciousness are modes of the mind. Samadhi transcends the mind. Devotee, still you can tell me what it is like. Bhagwan said, you will know only when you are in samadhi. Devotee asked, if the realized and the unrealized alike perceive the world, where is the difference between them? Bhagwan said, when the realized man sees the world, he sees the self, that is the substratum of all that is seen. Whether the unrealized man sees the world or not, he is ignorant of his true being, the self. Take the example of a film on a cinema screen. What is there in front of you before the film begins? Only the screen. On that screen you see the entire show, and to all appearances the picture are real. But go and try to take hold of them, and what do you take hold of? The screen on which the picture appears so real. After the play, when the picture disappears, what remains? The screens again. So it is with the self that alone exists. The pictures come and go. If you hold on to the self, you will not be deceived by the appearance of the pictures, nor does it matter at all whether the picture appears or disappears.